Several Western nations recently announced their intention to recognize a Palestinian state. Wait a second, doesn't Palestine already exist? Well, 75% of UN member states say it does, but that means 25% don't, including the US, the UK, France, and Australia. To make matters even more complicated, Palestinians themselves disagree about the most basic aspects of their state, like its borders and who runs their government. So why, after all the military confrontations, peace talks, and global declarations, is Palestine still not universally recognized as a state? We tend to think of maps as fixed, but the borders that demarcate where one country ends and another begins are surprisingly recent, and often very contentious. For example, Serbia doesn't recognize that Kosovo exists. China doesn't recognize the state of Taiwan's existence. And while Russia officially recognizes Ukraine, it doesn't recognize Ukraine's borders, and Russia's president has questioned Ukraine's right to exist as a fully independent state, and invaded. And in all these cases, the international community has to take a side. North Korea and Belarus are with Russia on Ukraine. China and Russia agree with the Serbs. But nowhere has the fight over whether or not a country exists received more attention than the fight over this slice of earth right here. This is the land of Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land, call it what you want. Jews and Palestinians have long called it the same thing, home. But for thousands of years, that home wasn't a country with internationally recognized borders. It was a small corner of a larger region in an even larger empire. Check out this map of the Ottoman Empire from 1794. We've got to zoom in, but what you'll see is a large region called Sham, Syria, which is full of additional borderless regions. The center of our story is here, Palestina, which, as you can see, has no actual border. Instead, these regions had localized administrative areas known as sanjaks, like a district within a larger province. For the Ottoman Empire and the world, Palestine was an area, but not a specific area with specific borders. But in the midst of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. In 1915, the British wanted some help to expedite the empire's demise. In exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, the British promised Arab independence in pretty much all the Middle East, including Palestine. But while within a year the revolt had started, the British and French had actually already drawn up a secret plan of their own. Assuming the world would function as it always had, with larger, stronger empires conquering and ruling vast territories, the Brits and French divvied up the Middle East between themselves. So, when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed after World War I, Britain and France took control of much of the Middle East. But their secret plan had a hitch. Old-school colonialism was on its way out. All over the world, ethnic groups were agitating to govern themselves, to decolonize. So the British began talking out of both sides of their mouth, promising some kind of self-determination to the region's various populations, sowing division while consolidating power for themselves. I know, classic colonialism. The British Foreign Secretary declared in 1917 that the Brits, quote, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. In other words, the British were making promises left, right, and center. The confusion fanned tensions between the region's long-standing Arab majority and Jewish minority communities. Tensions that were exacerbated by waves of Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Europe. In 1936, Arabs in Palestine revolted against the British, accusing them of importing a foreign entity to rule Palestine, the Jews being the foreigners. In response to the uprising, the British halted Jewish immigration to Palestine, just as European Jewry's fate became more dire than ever. But the British didn't stop there. They were about to radically alter the political discourse, with implications for today with their second suggestion: divide the land into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. It was the first formal two-state plan. While the Jewish community broadly supported the idea, it was perceived as nothing less than a land grab by the Palestinian Arabs. And the British? they hardly made any steps toward implementing it. But a little over a decade later, the UN approved a similar partition plan. A Jewish state here, here, and here, and an Arab state there, there, and there. The Jews agreed to these strange borders, happy to have any state after 2,000 years of longing. But the Arabs, they were like, hey, UN, who the flip gave you the right to give away our land? And the UN was like, we gave it to ourselves when everybody here agreed to join the UN. Well, when the British left on May 14, 1948, Israel's statehood was declared and quickly recognized by the United States and the Soviet Union, the big dogs. Within a year, 30 countries had recognized the existence of the Jewish state called Israel. The surrounding Arab states disagreed and invaded. When the fighting ended a year later, Israel hadn't just survived, but had greatly expanded its borders. More territory, but still locked out of Jerusalem's Old City, the Western Wall, and the Temple Mount. And this is when reality starts to officially fragment. For those who recognize the State of Israel, the maps looked like this. But for Jordan, the maps looked like this. Absolutely no recognition of Israel's existence. For other Arab states, the maps looked like this. No recognition of Israel or Jordan's occupation of the West Bank. Three different versions of reality that frequently crashed against each other in spasms of violence. For decades, the IDF clashed with Egyptian-financed Palestinian militants from Gaza who attacked Israeli border communities, aiming to one day conquer all of Palestine. Sound familiar? But then, everything changed, and once again, the maps of the Middle East were redrawn. 1967. Egypt and Syria were preparing to invade Israel. Israel took no chances with a devastating preemptive strike. The territory under Israel's control tripled in size and now included Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The latter two were where the vast majority of ancient Jewish history took place. So a lot of Jews were pretty psyched to return to what is biblically known as Judea and Samaria. The images of Jewish soldiers in East Jerusalem, at the Western Wall, and more importantly, atop the ancient Jewish Temple of Solomon, were deeply inspiring for Jews and deeply troubling for Muslims. Israel quickly annexed East Jerusalem, creating yet another contentious reality where Israelis see Jerusalem this way and the rest of the world see it this way. But even more important was the rest of the territory, which Israel simply occupied. Within Israel, there were different opinions on what to do with these occupied territories. Some wanted to give them back in exchange for peace with the Arab states. Others wanted to annex these territories with their deep biblical roots, making them officially part of the Jewish state. But with Arab states refusing to recognize Israel's existence, let alone negotiate, the territories remained in limbo, and tensions only grew. In these occupied territories, Palestinians had little to no say in how their affairs were governed. They were subject to the policies of Israeli government, but could not vote in Israeli elections. There's a word for that, not democracy, but never mind. As Palestinian aspirations for statehood grew, so did Palestinian militancy against Israel. The main driver of that violence was the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, who laid claim to all of Palestine with the boundaries it had during the British Mandate, denied any Jewish connection to the land, and committed itself to armed struggle as the only way to liberate Palestine. On the Israeli side, a new movement began to populate the areas Israel had occupied in 1967, the settlements. The first wave of settlers to move into the West Bank felt that Israel's borders until 1967 had been essentially indefensible, and that for Israel's long-term security, Israel needed to remain in the West Bank. And to do that, they started to move their families into the West Bank to force the Israeli government to bring the military in and hold on to the territory. The other group of settlers were Jewish idealists driven by the desire to live in the biblical heartland and wanted to ensure that Israel held on to Judea and Samaria. So these Israelis began building communities in the West Bank and in the Sinai and in Gaza. The Jewish settlements in Sinai were short-lived, uprooted in 1982 as part of a peace deal between Egypt and Israel. Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt, and Egypt became the first Arab state to recognize Israel's existence. Thank you, we exist! The next peace deal was between Israel and Jordan in 1994. Jordan finally agreed to recognize Israel's existence, but unlike the Egypt deal, Jordan didn't want the West Bank back, especially since the PLO had already officially laid claim to the land 6 years earlier in 1988. That's when the PLO took its first internationally recognized steps towards realizing the Palestinian national dream. A Palestinian poet drew up the Declaration of Palestinian Independence. The PLO ratified the declaration, naming its chairman, Yasser Arafat, as president. While declaring Jerusalem the capital of Palestine, the document was intentionally vague about the borders of this newly formed state. Was the state of Palestine here or here? By remaining vague, the PLO was allowing groups with different visions of the future to band together under one roof. Groups that wanted Jewish and Arab states living side by side could work together with groups that wanted to see Israel wiped off the map. But that lack of clarity also meant that Israelis couldn't be sure of the PLO's true intentions. Within a year, 89 countries had recognized the new state of Palestine. Over time, that number would double, but there were some critical holdouts: the US and Israel's European allies. For them, recognition of a Palestinian state could only happen once Israelis and Palestinians stopped attacking each other, sat down together, and negotiated a peace agreement, recognized the existence of the other's independent state, and recognized each other's borders. Western recognition for the state of Palestine was to be the Palestinians' reward for ending nearly a century of violence between these two communities and finally making peace with Israel. And by the 1990s, it looked like it might finally happen. The US, Israel, and the PLO drew up the Oslo Peace Accords. The PLO recognized the existence of the State of Israel, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. Right, not the State of Palestine, not yet. We'll get there. The Accords established areas of limited autonomy for a newly formed Palestinian government. The Palestinian Authority was formed to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza, with the idea that this would ultimately lead to a Palestinian state recognized by Israel and Israel's allies. But first, they'd need to negotiate some details, such as borders, Jerusalem's status, the Temple Mount, and what to do with millions of Palestinians whose parents and grandparents had once lived in what was now Israel. The sides trudged on, hoping to find a solution that would create two states side by side. But there were powerful forces on both sides that did not want the land split into two independent states. Israeli and Palestinian groups that refused to ever recognize the existence of another state on their land. Groups that saw the entirety of the land, from the river to the sea, as their ancestral heritage. Violence flared, settlements grew, trust collapsed, the peace process stalled, and each side blamed the other. In a series of negotiations meant to finalize the agreements on Palestinian statehood, Palestinian leaders repeatedly rejected offers put forth by Israel and the US. Most infamously, in 2000, the US and Israel proposed recognizing a Palestinian state in 100% of Gaza and 97% of the West Bank, with land swaps to make up for that last 3%. But it was an important 3%. Palestinian leaders declined. Negotiations collapsed, and the world was left divided into separate realities. For some, there is Israel and the occupied territories. For others, there's Israel and Palestine. And for others, there's simply Israel or Palestine. So in 2005, a frustrated Israel tried a completely new approach: pull out of Gaza entirely, without any negotiations or agreement with the Palestinians. Israel removed all Jewish communities and the military, and let the Palestinians govern themselves in Gaza. The result? Hamas took power in Gaza and kicked the Palestinian Authority out. Which means there were now effectively two separate Palestinian governments governing two separate Palestinian territories. They had different leadership, different laws, and very different visions for the future. Hamas was hoping to one day conquer all of Israel and the West Bank and establish an Islamic state, while the Palestinian Authority ostensibly sought to finish the Oslo process and take its more limited slice of the land. But for many Israelis, Hamas's takeover of Gaza became a dire warning, a preview of what might happen if they one day gave Palestinians more autonomy in the West Bank too. And in Gaza, things went from bad to worse. Hamas used its independence to build a vast rocket arsenal and a massive underground tunnel network. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Israel and Hamas had several bouts of violence, but finally seemed to have reached a détente. Israel thought Hamas was contained. Not only was Israel overwhelmingly dominant in battle, Hamas appeared ideologically softer, amending their charter in 2017 to include space for recognition of Israel. These moves turned out to be deliberate deception, meant to lure Israel into lowering its guard. But by the time Israel realized its mistake, it was already too late. October 7th, 2023, the deadliest day in Israel's history. For Israelis, October 7th was proof that Palestinians could not be trusted with their own independent state anytime soon. Recognizing a Palestinian state would be a grave mistake. But Palestinians disagreed. They argued it was precisely Israel's refusal to recognize a Palestinian state that led thousands of frustrated Palestinians to join Hamas and carry out October 7th. Therefore, recognizing a Palestinian state is the only solution. Of course, for Hamas and their supporters, the only solution is wiping Israel off the map and recognizing a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. Well, Western governments are caught in the middle of this mess, basically the same place they've been stuck for a century. Most recognize Israel's right to defend itself and free the kidnapped Israelis, but they're also growing concerned with successive humanitarian crises in Gaza. As international public opinion shifts, especially among younger voters, leaders in places like France, Britain, Australia, and Canada are looking for ways to respond to the crisis. They want to apply pressure on Israel to stop the fighting, leave Gaza, and progress towards recognizing a Palestinian state. The tool they're threatening to use is the recognition of a Palestinian state. And Israel's government has responded to these threats by saying they are a step backwards in the march towards peace. For Israelis, recognition at this time would be only one thing: a reward for Hamas's actions on and after October 7th. The argument is that recognition at this time only encourages Hamas to keep fighting, refuse a ceasefire deal, and continue to hold on to kidnapped Israelis. If October 7th and an endless military confrontation ends up boosting recognition of a Palestinian state, it teaches that terror works, and more terror will bring them closer to their goal of taking all of Israel. But for many Palestinians and their supporters, new countries recognizing a Palestinian state is a step toward justice, a chance to join more global institutions, to bring more cases against Israel in international courts, and further delegitimize Israel's occupation of the West Bank. But here's the twist. Some Palestinians are critical of the move to recognize Palestine, saying it's a hollow, symbolic gesture that does nothing practical to advance the Palestinian cause. See, the Palestinian Authority hasn't held national elections in almost 20 years. It is deeply corrupt and is overwhelmingly unpopular among Palestinians. So critics say recognizing the state of Palestine under the Palestinian Authority without demanding concessions from Israel or political reforms in the Palestinian Authority only serves to legitimize and maintain the status quo. New countries may soon recognize a state of Palestine that doesn't actually control its own borders or agree on those borders, lacks a unified government, and remains deeply fractured from within. Is this a step towards peace and justice? Or has the legacy of European colonialism led to new ways of drawing borders and sowing division in foreign lands? Let us know what you think in the comments.